Greetings and salutations, my name's David Rodwin and this is some epic bullshit. 4 days ago, I sprained my leg so badly that I can't walk again for another 2 weeks. I was playing a pickup game of soccer. That's right, I'm 41 years old and I still play soccer. Give it up, it's fun. And they prescribe rice for sprained ankles. That's right, rest, ice, compression, and elevation. And I've been doing all of the above. In fact, in the last 4 days, I haven't left my apartment once.
And that's why
I'm very excited because today I'm actually getting out of the apartment. That's right, I'm going outside and I'm going to see Charlayne Woodard's new one-woman show. I've known about Charlayne for over a decade, but somehow I've never seen one of her shows. I'll be back soon with a review. The Night Watcher turned out to be a solo show by Charlayne Woodard about how she's been avoiding having children of her own, but she enjoys playing auntie to all the children in her life. In terms of the performance, well, I could tell when she was playing the different characters, but she certainly didn't have the fire of an Eric Bogosian, and she also didn't have the absolute transformative ability of an Anna Deavere Smith. In terms of her storytelling abilities, she did not have the magnetic quality of Spalding Gray, and she didn't have the energy of a Mike Daisey. A major part of the problem, however, is the piece itself. The show starts with her being offered a baby to adopt. And over the course of the first act, 3 times people say, "You'd make a great mom, how'd you like to adopt this baby?" And every time she says, no. Now this gets really tricky, because autobiographical solo work is partially about the work itself and partially about the person. It's very difficult to disentangle the two. And while I'm sure Charlayne is a delightful friend, she portrays herself in a very ugly light. And more importantly, she seems to be completely unaware that she's doing this. In the talkback afterwards, she mentioned that in the development process, her director mentioned, "Hey, Charlayne, you seem kind of smug." And she said she addressed that. Perhaps she did, but only by making herself seem oblivious, meddling, self-righteous, and self-congratulatory. Just as a point of reference, my favorite solo performer is Spalding Gray, and he painted himself as a selfish, narcissistic man-child who betrayed the people who loved him most. And yet, I still loved almost everything that he did, partially because of his artistry and partially because he was self-aware. Being self-aware actually brings me to the side of the performer.
And for me, it generates a real sympathy and empathy to know that he is deeply fallible and flawed. And he knows it, and he does battle with it. But I got none of that from Charlayne. So what did she give us?
There were a series of stories all on a theme. The theme, you could say, was puppies and babies. That was actually a title of one of the chapters.
Because her mother was constantly calling her up and criticizing her for doting on her dogs instead of raising children of her own.
Puppies and Babies would be a better title for the entire show. It could have also been titled Kids Today, because all the stories had the same arc. She has a friend or family member who has a child. She goes and spends a day with them. She sees all the terrible things that this child does. She bawls out the child for doing what they do. And then she tells the parents how badly they're raising the child. The parents get extremely upset at her, tell her to mind her own business. And here's an example. She has a day with the child of a very good friend of hers. They're going to go into the city and they're going to shop. They're going to have a great girl time together. So as they're going in, the girl puts on some music, and it's gangster rap. Now, I don't want to defend the misogyny in gangster rap, but the kid just wants to listen to some fun music. Now, Charlayne listens to it and is horrified. She stops the car and has a talk with the girl. She says, "Well, do you know what they're saying?" She's like, yeah, they're talking about bitches and throwing them into ditches. She's like, "Well, what would you say the themes are in this song?" And the girl's like, "Well, I just think that, they were saying some crazy stuff because the crazier stuff that you say, more people will buy it. They're just trying to make some money." And frankly, I thought it was a very astute response of hers. But Charlayne remained indignant. Kids Today. She seemed more like Clint Eastwood in Gran Torino than some sort of loving liberal aunt. I was just shocked that every time Charlayne tried to make a point that was for her case, it simply turned me against her. She never once acknowledged that maybe she didn't understand where these kids were coming from.
Don't get me wrong. These kids had serious issues. They were obsessed with materialism, they got pregnant, and they got in trouble with the law.
And while I got portraits of troubled youths, I never got a sense of who she was. More importantly, I never saw that anything was ever at stake for her.
She's forever dealing with other people's problems, not her own. And the one time her worldview is challenged, instead of exploring whether she's made the right choices, she gets defensive. Then lets herself off the hook. In that scene,
she actually goes onto a subway and strikes up a conversation with an African. The African is a placeholder, like the way Morgan Freeman dispenses words of wisdom in white people's films. The African says, "You don't have children? What a waste." And during this conversation, she makes a case for herself, at the end of which the African says, "You're right. You're still a blessing to the world even though you don't have children." My God. The only time I began to get any insight into her was in the second act, when she finally reveals her inspiration. She talks about how she used to visit her aunt when she was a kid. Her aunt also did not have kids, and she idolized this aunt.
And while that uncovered the impetus for her choices in regard to having kids, she never showed any self-doubt that maybe she was missing out on something, that the commitment of being a parent provided a depth of relationship which was unattainable to her. If she'd expressed that doubt, and then overcame it through her interactions with these kids, then she would have provided a dramatic conflict for herself which I would have found compelling. But in her world, she's just right about everything. And that not only fails to win me over, it's downright anti-dramatic.
Now, some people there said that the play touched them very much. And I'm wondering, perhaps I'm just too different from her, but I don't think that's really it. She and I are both childless, work in the arts, and have done solo shows. How much more common ground do you need?
This isn't a personal attack on Charlayne. I know the courage it takes to get on stage and bare your life to a group of strangers. But if she couldn't find a way to look at her own internal conflict, I have to lay the blame for the dramaturgical failure at the feet of the director Daniel Sullivan, who shepherded this production from the very beginning. He should have made Woodard really scrutinize her own actions, because in the end, the lack of self-examination made this show a failure. And so you know, part of why I haven't tempered my review is because of the acclaim The Night Watcher has received. Don Shirley of LA Stage Watch even named it the best show of the year on KPCC, and I couldn't disagree more.
And if you missed the show, don't worry, it's going to be published as a book sometime very soon. My name's David Rodwin, and this was some epic bullshit.